et bienvenue. Est-ce que vous écoutez? Est-ce que vous écoutez moi?
Oui, oui.
Très bien. Buongiorno signori, aspettando, benvenuti alla seconda sessione del Convegno Internazionale in onore di Livio Rossetti. Stiamo aspettando l'assessore alla cultura del Comune di Perugia, Leonardo Varasano, che ci rivolgerà dei saluti istituzionali per conto del Comune. Qualche minuto di pazienza. Oggi abbiamo fatto il quarto d'ora accademico. Volevamo essere germanici, ma non ci siamo riusciti.
Il tavolo, quindi sono
lì in esposizione, poi dopo li facciamo dopo.
No, solo per curiosità.
Sono stati
Perfetto.
anche la linea siamo installati sul dirigente.
Perfetto, molto bene io.
Ci sono anche colleghi collegati dall'estero.
Benissimo.
Il microfono è vicino.
Sì. La ringrazio. Buongiorno a tutti, apro con piacere questa seconda giornata del Convegno Internazionale di Studi dedicato al professor Livio Rossetti e ai 50 anni di studi sul pensiero greco. Vi do il mio benvenuto personale, quello dell'amministrazione comunale, del sindaco Romizzi. Quando il professor Ranocchia, che ancora ringrazio, ha voluto coinvolgerci in questa iniziativa, abbiamo subito accolto con grande piacere, con estremo favore, la possibilità di ospitare una giornata del convegno qui in una delle sale più prestigiose del nostro palazzo comunale. E questo perché volevamo, e abbiamo colto il senso di questa iniziativa, volevamo partecipare ad un momento molto significativo per la nostra città, per la nostra università, e credo che non sia un caso, anzi sicuramente non è un caso, che si siano toccati i luoghi più importanti della storia della cultura perugina, a partire dal nostro antico studium, il comune, e poi si concluderà a Palazzo Cesaroni con la lectio magistralis del professor Rossetti. Questo perché? Perché in questa occasione si celebrano, credo, tre cose: la gratitudine, la restituzione e la riflessione. La gratitudine credo che sia specificamente per quello che il professor Rossetti ha fatto per la nostra città, per la nostra università. Lui, sappiamo, viene ricordato anche nella sua biografia, non è nativo di Perugia, ma di fatto è figlio adottivo e soprattutto ha un legame profondissimo con il nostro Ateneo, ma quello che ha fatto più in generale per la comunità scientifica. Allora la gratitudine è un sentimento e una prassi poco frequentata da noi. Non a caso Papa Francesco ci invita a verbalizzare il grazie, no? Però ci sono vari modi per dare forma a questo grazie, e uno è questo, è il riconoscimento del cammino fatto,
Graziano, we have lost your sound. Your sound is off. Please turn on your sound.
Me now?
Yes, finally, thank you.
Sorry about that. So, ancora una volta vi presento due veri giganti di studi eliatici, Alex Murelatos e Nestor Cordero, per la prima sessione di questa mattina, e penso che è meglio cominciare subito con la presentazione di Alexander Murelatos, titled Xenophanes of Colophon, Ionian Physicalist and Iconoclast in Religion.
Molte grazie. I want to start by expressing my very, very happy, really happy gratitude for one of the most precious friendships that I have made in the last 30 years, which is my friendship with Livio Rossetti. Thank you, Livio. It was, well, I don't remember, it must have been at least 30 years ago when we met. And at that time, the idea of Eleatica was only in his mind. And before too long, it became a reality. And now it's going to, I forget, 15th session or whatever. Maybe it's already 20th, I don't know. You know, in old age, years pass by very quickly. I know we're late starting, so I will proceed with my presentation. I need to tell you that there's an unfortunate happening, which is that my hearing aids have failed. So in the discussion, I may
Mr. Ranocchia, your sound is off again. Alex, we cannot hear you now. It just went off 1 minute ago.
Ok, ma prima ci sentivano.
Okay,
all right,
Okay.
you can go on, please. Go ahead. Era spento il microfono, non so per quella.
Excuse me. Okay.
has the
It should
problem
work
been
now.
fixed for those?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
What our friends on the web say?
Yeah, they
Okay.
can hear us now.
Ma prima ci sentivano.
Problem been fixed?
Ok, all right,
Okay.
you can go on, please. Go ahead. Era spento il microfono, non so per quella.
Excuse me. Okay.
Has the
It should
problem
work
been
now.
fixed for those?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you see? Yeah,
it is-
now it is on. Now it is on. Please don't touch it.
Okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Go
Professor
ahead.
Murados.
Go ahead.
Okay, I trust the problem has been fixed. So the numbering I follow is the traditional one in the Diels-Kranz edition. The translations I will be using are the ones in the Lux Nostra Logo. So here we go. Fragment B16, the Ethiopians say that gods are snub-nosed and dark-skinned, whereas Thracians say that they have blue eyes and reddish hair. Mortals, that's 14, but mortals believe that gods come to be born with clothing, voice, and bodily frame just like theirs, meaning the mortals' own. B11, Homer and Hesiod have attributed to the gods all sorts of things which among men are sources of blame and censure, thieving, committing adultery, and deceiving one another. B15, but if oxen and horses or lions had hands, or could draw with their hands and create work such as men create, then horses would make their gods look like horses, and oxen make them look like oxen. And generally, together by modern scholars in B22-3. What precisely is the scope of the comparison, namely among both gods and men? That's a question. In the Xenophonist universe, there are also minor gods that would serve to broaden the germane basis of comparison with the one and greatest God. That's one question. Or are these plural gods simply plasmataton proteron, figments of our predecessors? And the references to things like titans, giants, and censors that Xenophonus himself had mentioned in the Symposium Elegy. Non-entities, just posited by misguided human imagination. I think it is significant that after the mention of both gods and humans in B23:1, the second line drops reference to plural gods and narrows the comparison simply to humans. There would be no point in making comparisons between lesser gods and the supreme deity, for by B14 and the other fragments of the one God group, whether such minor gods exist or not, their traits are sweepingly anthropomorphic. So that must be why humans are and their traits are that humans are cited in the second line of B23 in the comparison, only humans are cited in the comparison with the one greatest God. In the case of B25, there is certainly the temptation to interpret the fragment on the model of the familiar Judeo-Christian creation account. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Ostensibly, there is one other fragment that might be taken to envisage divine demiurgic activity in Xenophonus. B38. If God, whether it be the lesser gods or the supreme God, had not created yellow honey, then mortals would say that figs are a lot sweeter. But since B35 is manifestly another instance of Xenophonian counterfactual thought experiment, it would be wrong to exploit the F as direct evidence of demiurgic activity in Xenophonus. We may return now to B25 and its no freni by mental act or simply by a mental act. Xenophonus needs to make it intelligible to his listeners, readers, that that's how God imparts this shaking and trembling to all things, and does it without fail, and also without himself moving at all. Xenophonus reminds them, his listeners or readers, of the sovereign power that every human knows and every is capable of and possesses. Human mental powers are, in this respect, also unlimited. At any time, we can bring to mind or choose to direct our attention to absolutely anything. So if humans have this extraordinary ability, then the incomparably greater power of the single God knows and friend should be able to make not just something of thought in the mind, but incomparably a greater power to make things actual or present, not just to God's mind, and not just to the mind of humans, but actually present in the universe. Thus, no framing serves not so much to suggest large-scale demiurgy as later monotheistic faiths presented. Rather, it mediates a simile. God's mind, human mind, simile between God's mind and the human mind, and then adds the appropriate augmentation that must be applied in the case of God, God's mind. If the four fragments cited at the start, taken together with the one God fragments, had been the only ones preserved from Xenophon's poetry, this would have sufficed to ensure his high standing as a first-class radical philosopher pioneer. Curiously, this is not what has happened, even though we have a lot more material, both fragments and testimonials, from Xenophanes than we have for other early Greek thinkers. And this may and this may be the with matters now to what matters to the evidence that the iconoclasm and the radical theology are extensively and indigently supported by the physics and the cosmology. It's really interesting that so often when new books of selections of the pre-Socratics come out, the one philosopher that is omitted for reasons of space is Xenophanes. And in the discussion, I can tell you more about why this has happened, but I think it's important for everybody to be aware of that. The classic preparatory term, mortals, is often applied catachrestically, of course, in Xenophanes because of his one and greatest God. But fragments of central bearing, as well as testimonial, suggest that in the case of what would be called secular primary entities, he is not a monist, but a dualist. Fragment B29. Earth and water are everything that comes into being and grows. B33. All of us have come out of earth and water. One might propose, of course, that the broadly cosmological part, which is in B29, should be interpreted on the model of the other fragment, B33, with its more restrictive scope of all humans, all living things. The two formulations, of course, are logically compatible. They're in a species to genus relationship. But the extreme boldness of scope in fragment B29 is emphasized by the addition of the explication, everything that comes into being and grows. Moreover, The mere fact that both narrow scope and broad scope quantum formulations have been preserved in the fragments makes it likely that the metaphysically crucial statement is to be found in B29 with its panta. But can we be sure that Xenophanes is a dualist? One fragment might be thought to summarize his doctrine as earth monism, B27. For from earth come all these things, and to earth they all end up. The ambiguities in this line are unfortunately numerous. Is the line merely a pagan precursor of the later commonplace ashes to ashes, dust to dust? Does Gaia mean earth stuff, or the earth as an entity? In either case, the remark would be true only of plants, perhaps also of some insects. Does the use of Gaia with the preposition case point to origins or to constitution, auto, and crucially, what is the scope of panta? Is it totally unrestricted, absolutely all, everything, or does it refer back to some narrower class that had been suppressed in extracting this from the context? In any event, since it does not say out of earth alone or only out of earth, the line, as it has been preserved, is compatible with dualism. Everything is out of earth because every compound has that is predominantly recognizable as water, nevertheless also has some earth in it, or because compounds that are ostensibly combinations of earth and water, and there exists in a nurturing environment of soil. But given the uncertainties of the line being 27, it would be good to look for thematic support in Xenophanes' cosmological dualism more broadly. The context, from the context other than B27 and B127, I believe we have such support in Xenophanes' delineation of the two regions of the cosmos, B28. This is the limit of the earth. Above one sees it at our feet as it breaks against prostrazum, the air. Below, it stretches without a limit. The crucial terms are this limit above and below without a limit. Picture two bodies of masses of volumes A and B that are separated by just a single dotted planar limit. Then add the specification that B stretches to depth without a limit. The inevitable consequence of these two conditions is that not only B, but also H stretches in the same way, without a limit, away from the symbol limit. For if A was limited, it would have a limit either laterally or towards the left or towards the right or both, or even above. As one or three of these additional limits are assumed, this would violate the stipulation total, the single limit. So even quite abstractly, by the mere pointing of a single cosmic limit, Xenophanes signals that the cosmological scheme he assumes is a dualism of two primary stars. One cannot fail to notice, however, that the shifts mentioned in B28 are not earth and water, but rather earth and air, adding those plugs. We encounter at this point a notable asymmetry in Xenophanes' cosmological dualism. The stuff earth, associated as it is with solidity, hardness, light blocking, shadow making, imperviousness, non-mobility, or resistance to mobility. Does not
Okay. Here he is. Okay, so let's open the discussion. Is there any question? Yes, Barbara.
Thanks, Nicholas. I have to say, when I ask my question, it may be that you said something on that and I missed it because it was sometimes hard to hear. But the question is, how does the kind of physical dualism that you saw, metaphysical dualism as you call it, right? How does this fit together with this kind of priority monism that we see in with the divine? It's just because you should be with your system applicator, right? All the different concepts, so therefore I thought the language, you should also find a way to bring to say this priority monism.
Okay, we have a second question, and you can just hand the microphone to the next person.
Thank you very much, Alex. I have two big questions. And number one is that the fragments, I've always been struck by the fact that fragment B2C is not talking about how often and causes someone would conceive of the gods, but how they would draw the gods. Comment on the fact that it is representation, and indeed aesthetic representation, rather than conception that seems to be at stake there. So, yeah, I mean, let me stay with this question.
Well, basically, that's not really, I suppose, it's just the way to do the document conception is the
How the gods are represented, how the gods are represented in art. And I think that tells us something about the importance of artistic representation of the gods. I think it's a long line that brings us then to the rational theology of the Republic.
Okay. We'll switch over to Nestor Luis Cordero.
This or this?
It's the same.
Oh, you get this one. Okay. So we come now from. No, stay here. Veniamo adesso a Parmenide, da Xenofane a Parmenide con Nestor Luis Cordero e con la presentazione titolata Secondo Parmenide bisogna sapere che cosa sono le doxae per evitarle, e penso che è una domanda. Allora, Nestor.
Grazie. Vado a tentare di parlare l'italiano, vediamo, ma prima di cominciare vediamo perché, secondo Parmenide, bisogna sapere che sono le doxae, ma per evitarle. Fin dalle sue origini, la filosofia ha presupposto invece proprio della preghiera o del discorso del tiranno è vuoto, è afilosofico. La preghiera porta di solito una polemica tra due modi di cercare di spiegare la realtà. Da un lato c'è ciò che si dice sulla realtà, dall'altro la spiegazione proposta dal filosofo. Va da sé che quanto appena detto era solo una ipotesi nel caso dei pensatori di Mileto, data la scarsità dei testi recuperati, ma diventa realtà man mano che il numero di citazioni si fa più abbondante, a partire di Xenofane. Questo è già il caso dei tre primi presocratici, sui quali abbiamo abbastanza materiale per giustificare la nostra posizione. Infatti, Xenofane, Eraclito e Parmenide presentano le loro filosofie come un rifiuto più o meno virulento delle opinioni comuni e consuete o di ciò che hanno detto altri pensatori. Prendiamo il caso di Xenofane. La dossografia abbondante sottolinea il carattere polemico dell'atteggiamento di Xenofane. Pseudo Plutarco, ad esempio, afferma che, cito, Xenofane seguì un percorso personale che si discostava dalle persone di cui abbiamo parlato. Abbiamo parlato di Talenta Nascimento Nascimene. Perché? Poiché supprimeva la generazione e la corruzione e pensava che il tutto fosse sempre uguale. È una citazione del pseudo Plutarco. Proclo, da parte sua, riteneva Xenofane di, cito, aver scritto i soliti siloi, atopus siloi, riguardanti tutti i filosofi e i poeti. E evidentemente il riferimento ai poeti alludeva all'opinione tradizionale. E Ario Didimo aggiunge, come prova della citazione, aggiunge come prova la citazione letterale che dice, frammento 34, che ogni uomo, aner, Parmenide dirà protos o antropos, ogni uomo sa che tutto è opinione, tutto è dokos. Per lui, per Xenofane, i mortali, protoi, lo stesso parola di Parmenide, protoi, che credono, dokeusi, verbo legato ad oxa, che gli dei siano nati. E come risposta all'opinione rappresentata dal verbo doxaso in Xenofane, Xenofane espone la verità che da tempo cerca di diffondere in molte città greche. Frammento 23, c'è un Dio, questa è la posizione di Xenofane, c'è un Dio che nella forma, nel pensiero è simile a quello dei mortali. Il caso di Eraclito è più radicale. Perché? Perché Eraclito costituisce la sua filosofia come una critica sia dei filosofi precedenti, sia della folla in generale. Per quanto riguarda la folla, spesso chiamata hoipoloi, per Eraclito è come se dormesse. Frammento 89, per cui dorme c'è un unico universo, c'è un universo particolare. Frammento 70, sono schiavi delle opinioni, doxasmata, che non sono altro che giochi dei bambini. E anche l'individuo più famoso è vittima di ciò che si dice. Frammento 28, il più famoso, dokimotatos, conosce e protegge le opinioni, dokeonta. Infine, nel frammento 17, la sua critica di Eraclito, è ancora più generale. La folla, hoipoloi, non capisce le cose come le incontra. Esse le sembrano, dokeusi, le sembrano soltanto. Abbiamo visto che sia in Xenofane, sia in Eraclito, il punto di partenza della loro filosofia è la critica delle opinioni, sia della folla che dei filosofi precedenti. Le opinioni si mostrano palesemente come il modo più ovvio di credere di sapere ciò che in realtà si ignora. Ma poiché gli esseri umani, Aristotele dixit, appetiscono naturalmente conoscere, cito Xenofane, frammento 35, credono che ciò che presumono dedoxasto assomigli alla realtà. Percorrono i mortali a ritroso la strada della conoscenza. Applicano alle cose reali le opinioni che hanno su di esse, invece di partire dalle cose reali e, una volta conosciute, descriverle così come sono. Ci rimane Parmenide, il nostro eroe. Il suo caso è più interessante perché si basa sulla necessità di non seguire l'opinione, come Eraclito e Xenofane, ma prima di decidere che sono ingannevoli, bisogna conoscerle. Questa è l'originalità di Parmenide. Per Parmenide, il punto di partenza della ricerca della verità, la mia posizione, è la conoscenza della natura ingannevole delle opinioni. Le opinioni sono il punto di partenza, la falsità delle opinioni, della ricerca della verità. Anche nel caso di Parmenide, le opinioni doxai appartengono ad altri, come in Xenofane ed Eraclito. E come loro, questi altri sono chiamati uomini o mortali, protoi o antropoi. Ma per ragioni che noi conosciamo, quando Parmenide fornisce un esempio molto concreto di doxai nel frammento 8, presenta una vera teoria. Non era il caso di Xenofane o Eraclito. Non sappiamo se si trattasse di un coraggio di Parmenide, di opinioni alla moda, oppure, cosa più probabile, e io credo averlo dimostrato in un articolo nella rivista Arcai, forse è un ramo del pitagorismo particolare in Elea, rappresentato da Amilia, il primo maestro, tra virgolette, di Parmenide, questo ramo pitagorico avrebbe privilegiato i nomi invece dei numeri, ma è una mia ipotesi questa. Le dossai sono già presenti all'inizio del poema di Parmenide. Noi conosciamo l'inizio del poema di Parmenide in una lunga citazione del Sesto Empirico, e il Sesto Empirico dice il poema, il Perifusio di Parmenide cominciava così. Adesso che questo testo è l'inizio del poema è quasi sicuro. In questo lungo frammento 1 noi troviamo in realtà una presentazione allegorica del poema. La dea anonima, portavoce di Parmenide, dice, cito, è necessario, creo, che tu indaghi piuttosto su ogni cosa, sia dal cuore intrepido della rotonda verità, sia dalle opinioni dei mortali. E c'è la parola opinioni, proton doxat, nelle quali non c'è vera fiducia. È già qualche cosa. La nozione di necessità sottolinea il carattere obbligatorio del doppio apprendimento, verità-opinione. Perché? Perché una delle possibilità è la negazione dell'altra e al momento opportuno il mortale, il discepolo della dea, dovrà fare una scelta. Dopo aver appreso il vero discorso, il piston logos da un lato e l'ordine ingannevole delle parole, frammento 852, dall'altro, il futuro filosofo farà la sua scelta, l'una o l'altra. È vero che già fin dalla presentazione dell'alternativa verità doxa, la dea inizia a fornire informazioni che svalutano già a priori le doxai. Dice la dea, non sono convincente perché non si può fidare nelle doxe, mentre il vero discorso sarà quello della persuasione, il discorso del peito. Tuttavia, forza consapevole dello stupore che produrrà nell'ascoltatore la necessità di imparare necessariamente anche le doxai, la dea aggiunge una giustificazione di questa necessità alla fine del frammento 1 in una frase introdotta, come si dice nella grammatica, dal connettore concessivo empes, rinforzato da Allah. Cito Parmenide, ma comunque all'empes devi imparare anche questo. La particella empes, secondo la grammatica greca, ha un significato molto specifico. In una frase subordinata introduce la giustificazione di un punto della frase principale precedente. Nel verso 31 di Parmenide, frammento 1, si spiega perché bisogna essere consapevole il discepolo anche delle dossai. Perché? Perché se la verità non esistesse, le opinioni si disperserebbero sempre ovunque. Il futuro filosofo deve imparare che in questo caso, nel caso che la verità non esistesse, sarebbe stato necessario che l'oggetto dell'opinione, tratto punta, esistesse autenticamente, abbracciando ogni cosa incessantemente. Tratto punta non introduce, come si dice, un terzo soggetto da imparare. Il participio do punta è sinonimo di doxai. La frase completa, la frase nel quale si trova la parola do punta, completa e giustifica l'affermazione precedente e sarebbe stato inappropriato per Parmenide cambiare il soggetto di una orazione all'altra. Docunta e doxai appartengono alla famiglia di parole di docheo, il cui significato abituale è mi sembra, docheimoi, non mi appare, mi sembra. Docunta non sono apparenze, sono quello che mi sembra. Ma in Parmenide Chi sono gli autori delle doxai? La folla, tutto il mondo? Abbiamo visto che nel caso di Xenofane si trattava generalmente dai mortali. Eraclito si riferiva a hoi polloi e a tutta una serie di saggi e filosofi che lo avevano preceduto. Parmenide, da parte sua, parla in generale di mortali o di uomini, ma c'è un dettaglio che non ha meritato l'attenzione degli storici della filosofia che ci sono interessati ai doxai in Parmenide, e che è molto importante. Prima di proporre l'esempio delle doxai, a partire dal verso 51 del frammento 8, Parmenide descrive prima, in modo molto dettagliato, lungo 14 versi, la personalità e il metodo degli artefici delle opinioni. Questi tre passaggi sono il verso 4 e 9 del frammento 6, verso 2 e 5 del frammento 2 e versi 38 e 41 del frammento 8. Ora, quando compaiono gli esempi di doxai, a partire dal verso 51 del frammento 8, il lettore o l'ascoltatore della Dea sa già che i doxai non hanno valore perché hanno stato già svalutati a priori, perché erano l'oggetto di gente che non sa niente. Per giustificare il carattere negativo del cammino panapeutea, il cammino panapeutea del frammento 2 e il cammino della doxa, la Dea aveva descritto in 3 testi la personalità dei sostenitori delle opinioni. Nel primo dei 3 testi, frammento 6, verso 4-9, dice: c'è una via tracciata dai mortali, brotoi, che non sanno nulla, uomini a 2 testi, perché nei loro petti l'incapacità guida l'intelletto errante. Essi agiscono come ciechi e sordi, e stupefatti, persone prive della facoltà di giudizio, acrita fulla, per le quali l'essere e il non essere sono considerati la stessa cosa e non la stessa cosa. L'altra via, la via della Dea, invece riconduce al punto di partita. In questo passo si trova una descrizione dettagliata dello stato d'animo di coloro che hanno plasmato Platontai, il verbo, il cammino delle opinioni. Come diceva Ettore Scola, sono gente brutta, sporca, cattiva. La precisione e la concisione di questo passo sono esemplari perché in 6 versi troviamo il quadro composito di ciò che si aspetta di un cattivo ricercatore. I mortali fabbricano una realtà, vedremo più avanti che si basano solo sull'antitesi più ovvia, quella della luce e le tenebre, e poi, quando cercano di spiegare il reale, trovano nel reale solo le parole che hanno appicciato alle cose, credendo, il verbo che poi totes, che fossero vere. Infatti, abbiamo un secondo testo, e il secondo testo che parla dello stato degli uomini sono i versi 38 e 41 del frammento 8. In questi versi la Dea dice che poiché non c'è nulla in più di ciò che è Leon, sono solo nomi o nomata ciò che i mortali brotoi hanno stabilito, convinti che fosse la verità. Esempio generale è morire, essere e non essere, cambiare il logo e alterare il colore esteriore. A parte il carattere enigmatico di queste ultime parole, cosa vuol dire in Parmenide cambiare il colore esteriore, non so, questa descrizione denuncia il sintomo già rilevato dai mortali, l'incapacità di giudicare, di crinei. Perché? Perché sono acrita, sono uomini a 2 teste, vittima della congiunzione affermano una cosa e il contrario, essere e non essere, generare e morire, mentre che il filosofo, chi non è acrita, sa che la vera scelta è la disgiunzione, estin e hoc estin, una cosa o l'altra, non le due insieme. Data la personalità dei mortali, la Dea ordina ai suoi ascoltatori di evitare questo percorso. Fermento 7, verso 2-5, tieni il tuo pensiero lontano da questo cammino di ricerca e non lascia che l'abitudine inveterata ti costringa a usare l'occhio che non vede, l'udito che restituisce solo un eco della lingua. Questo è il terzo passaggio che noi abbiamo citato per descrivere l'attitudine degli uomini. Il riferimento all'abitudine inveterata, ethos polupeiron, è senza dubbio una allusione a non lasciarsi sopraffare da quello che sembra come il principio più normale della realtà, la luce e le tenebre. Per anni, io parlo di me adesso, abbiamo espresso la nostra opposizione radicale a trovare due parti nel poema arbitrariamente designate, queste due parti, la verità e la doxa, che Parmenide tratti della verità, soprattutto dal cuore della verità, il cuore della verità, e che dica qualche parola sulla doxa non significa che abbia deciso di dedicare 8 frammenti all'una e 11 all'altra. I due termini, verità e doxa, compaiono qua e là, secondo la metodologia didattica della Dea, che aveva già annunciato che per lei era comune, se non da dove incominciare, perché sarebbe tornata di nuovo su questo punto. Incomincio dalla verità e arrivo alla doxa, incomincio dalla doxa e arrivo alla verità, perché sono opposte. I sostenitori di considerare autentica una divisione del poema chiamano la doxa di Parmenide l'insieme che va dal verso 51 del frammento 8 al frammento 19. Numeri, come noi sappiamo, arbitrari, peraltro che derivano dall'opera classica di Feuerbach, sulla quale Manfred ha scritto un articolo molto, molto interessante. Ma questa gente dimentica che Parmenide aveva già avanzato una descrizione spietata degli autori delle doxai nella parte che loro chiamano la verità, cioè nella parte che questi ricercatori chiamano verità c'è una descrizione della doxa. Ora, ci sarebbero contaminazioni reciproca tra le parti doxa e verità, e questo riferimento ai mortali distolgono completamente qualsiasi valore positivo delle doxai, della cosiddetta parte la doxa. Vediamo alcuni esempi. I sostenitori dell'assistenza di una seconda parte non possono negare che i doxai fossero già presenti nella prima parte, che essi chiamano la verità, dal verso 2 al verso 50 del frammento 8. Le opinioni sono già enunciate nel frammento 1 come appartenenti ai mortali, nel frammento 6 la via dei mortali era già stata descritta, nel frammento 7 la Deva aveva aggiunto ai suoi ascoltatori di evitare questa via, la via dei mortali, e infine nel frammento 8, prima dal verso 51, i mortali sono caratterizzati come nominalisti avant la lettre, perché danno nomi alle cose credendoli veri. Tutti questi riferimenti agli autori delle doxai che si trovano nella cosiddetta prima parte del poema vengono ignorati quando si tratta di esporre la doxai alla fine del frammento 8. Fedele al suo metodo circolare, dopo aver ordinato al discepolo di allontanarsi dal sentiero dell'opinione nel frammento 7, la Dea espone nel frammento 8 il semata dell'unico sentiero che rimane. E la presentazione si tratta di una presentazione di semata in cui si trova il fondamento della necessità e dell'assolutezza dell'essere. Perché? Perché non essere è impossibile, semplicemente. Si tratta di un piston logo, dice Parmenide, e secondo il metodo circolare la dea dopo questo piston logo annuncia che d'ora in poi, a potute, si occuperà delle opinioni dei mortali. Tuttavia, perché è già noto quale sia la personalità dei mortali, la dea dice al suo discepolo che in realtà egli ascolterà una serie ingannevole di parole, una serie apateron di parole. L'aggettivo ingannevole, apateron, è inequivocabile. La dea esporrà un insieme di parole, non un logos. Non c'è un logos. La doxa un logos ha certe esigenze che le doxa non hanno. Questa via, la via della verità, era pistos perché apparteneva, tutto che si dice in questa via, alla persuasione. E la persuasione in Parmenide è peitus, e la nozione opposta a peitus è apate, inganno. Persuasione, inganno. La descrizione delle doxai riprende la nozione di nominazione già attribuita ai mortali nel frammento 8. Stabilirono due punti di vista, gnomas, per dare i nomi, onomasai, a ciò che appare, di cui non fecero un'unità, in cui si sbagliarono, estimarono l'esistenza di forme opposte e posero prove lontane l'una dall'altra. Da un lato il fuoco etereo della fiamma, tenue e leggerissimo, assolutamente uguale a se stesso, ma non uguale all'altro. Dall'altro ciò che di per sé è il suo opposto, la notte oscura, una forma spessa e pesante. Ho citato il frammento 8, la fine. La nozione di gnome, qui è sinonimo di opinione, ha la funzione di nominare le cose secondo le potenze di ciò che è più evidente, la luce e le tenebre. Per potenze Parmenide utilizza la nozione di dynamis, ma in linea con tutto ciò che sappiamo sui mortali, questi mortali sono vittime della congiunzione, sono una acrida fila, che mette insieme principi che in realtà sono contraddittori. Abbiamo visto che i semata sono lontani l'uno dall'altro. Il testo, ora noto come frammento 8, non aggiunge nuovi elementi sulla doxa, perché il frammento 8 termina 8 verso dopo questa descrizione della doxa. E la dea alla fine del frammento 8 afferma che i mortali con questi principi, la parola principio non è in Parmenide, appare in Simplicio, influenzato da Aristotele, i mortali hanno elaborato una diacosmon eikota, qualche cosa di simile, un diacosmon di simile a una disposizione cosmica, ma simile, ergo verosimile, non vera, verosimile. In altri frammenti recuperati del poema, noi sappiamo che si hanno recuperato 19 citazioni del poema perduto. In altri frammenti, situazioni recuperate, citate anche da Simplicio, troviamo un esempio di questo diacosmon. Questo è solo il frammento 9 e il frammento 12. Vediamo il frammento 9. Simplicio cita più volte il frammento 8, ma in una delle citazioni, alla pagina 180 del suo commento alla fisica di Aristotele, il suo testo termina al verso 59, alla parola pesante. Mancano i versi 60 e 61. E poi il verso 59 aggiunge la formula simplicio, kai metto ligapalin, equivalente a, e subito dopo, e Simplicio cita quello che si chiama oggi frammento nuovo, dove vediamo il modo di operare dei principi contrapposti. Cito il frammento cosiddetto frammento 9, ma poiché ogni cosa è stata chiamata per mezzo di questi o di quelli, il tutto è pieno, ascoltate, è pieno allo stesso tempo, homo di luce e di notte oscura, uguale l'una dell'altra, perché al di fuori non c'è nulla, al di fuori non c'è nulla. Tutto è quindi manifestazione dei poteri che si trovano nella luce e nelle tenebre, poteri che sono adattati alle cose. E Parmenide ritorna ai due elementi, luce e tenebra, ma che ci permettono di mettere questo frammento in relazione anche con la doxa, anche se la parola doxa non figura. Il riferimento si trova dopo un'altra citazione del frammento 8, che questa volta arriva alla fine, verso il verso 61. Scrive allora Simplicio, ancora una volta, kai mettalo ligappalin, kai poco dopo avanti, egli, Parmenide, parla nuovamente dei due elementi, è Simplicio che parla, di due stoicheion, e spiega la causa producice in questo modo, un vocabolario aristotelico-platonico, in Simplicio. Cito Simplicio, che cita Parmenide, gli anelli, le più strette, sono piene di fuoco puro, quelle che seguono di notte, fuoco puro, notte, luce e tenebre. Ma tra di esse sfugge una porzione di fiamma. In mezzo a loro, supposiamo gli anelli, c'è la Dea che governa tutto. È evidente che questo testo riprende dettagli del dualismo della diacosmesi tossica, come dice il citatore Simplicio, ma Simplicio parla anche di una Dea che governa tutto, e questo rimane per me almeno enigmatico. Simplicio disse che questi versi, cito Simplicio, attenzione, Simplicio un millenario dopo Parmenide, 1000 anni dopo, Simplicio dice che Parmenide qui riguarda la generazione di ciò che non è corporeo, asomaton. E in questo passo la Dea, cito Simplicio sempre, invia le anime a volte dal visibile all'invisibile, a volte reciprocamente. Commento che aggiunge ulteriore oscurità, ormai tinta del platonismo, a un testo già oscuro. Consapevoli di questo fatto, dell'oscurità del testo, nella stessa pagina Simplicio, con grande onestà intellettuale, ammette: sono costretto di soffermarmi su questo a causa della grande ignoranza oggi degli scritti antichi. Sembra che Simplicio non trovi in Parmenide una spiegazione sufficientemente chiara delle doxe e aggiunga commenti personali, mentre in realtà avrebbe dovuto mettere in discussione il carattere parmenideo delle doxe, perché Parmenide attribuisce le doxe agli altri, non a se stesso. Infine, in un testo recuperato tardivamente, nell'anno 1810, chiamato oggi frammento 19, prima si avevano trovato di 18, questo nuovo frammento si chiama 19 arbitrariamente. Questo testo fa una sorta di bilancio dell'universo tossico. Parmenide dice: così sono nate le cose catadoxam e sono presenti ad ora. Catadoxam. E poi, una volta sviluppati, moriranno. Per ogni cosa gli uomini, antropoi, hanno proposto un nome distintivo. Gli uomini, non io Parmenide, loro. Presumiamo, a parte gli ultimi versi del frammento 8, del frammento 9, frammento 12 e questo frammento 19, cercare la presenza e quello che Parmenide stesso, non gli interpreti, chiama doxai, è un pernicioso anacronismo. Nessun'altra citazione dall'insieme dei frammenti che, dalla divisione del poema in due parti, sono stati collocati di ufficio nella sessione della doxa, cioè i frammenti 10, 11, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 e 18, nessuno di questo frammento si basa in una diacosmesis che riconosce la luce e le tenebre come principio, che sono il fondamento della doxa. Non c'è niente di tossico in tutto questo. La Dea espone una teoria che appartiene a personaggi anonimi quando parla della doxa, teoria che, mutatis mutandis, come si può dedurre dal frammento 9, trova nel cosmo soltanto due principi, dottrina che potrebbe essere applicata a tutti i fisiologi che, secondo lo schema aristotelico, proponevano come principi due elementi opposti. Questi altri, forse, sono questi i filosofi precedenti. Ogni cosa ha i suoi poteri, dunamis, ma ogni filosofo deve adattare la spiegazione delle cose a questo principio. Nel caso di Anasimene, per esempio, Aristotele spiega tutto per rarefazione e condensazione del principio unico. Nel caso dei mortali, esposto da Parmenide, le potenze proprie di ciascuna cosa sono state ridotte alla coppia luce-notte, che si suppone essere alla base di una probabile cosmologia. Poiché non c'è nulla più ovvio che l'alternanza del giorno e della notte, evidentemente i mortali fanno di questa alternanza i principi, vocabolario aristotelico utilizzato per simplicio, di tutte le cose, ma il principio che sono simultanei, anche se sono contrari. Abbiamo visto la parola homo nel frammento 6, verso 5. L'esempio proposto dall'idea è molto accattivante, perché nessuno può negare l'alternanza degli opposti, il ritmo delle stagioni, nemmeno l'altro, il giorno e la notte. Pertanto, potrebbe essere tentato di spiegare tutto attraverso l'opposizione la più ovvia, quella tra luce e tenebre. Ma l'autentico aspirante a filosofo non deve, cito Parmenide, non deve, citazione letterale, lasciarsi prendere d'assalto o invadire, parelasse, da nessun punto di vista mortale, da nessuna gnomi broton, dice la Dea nel verso 61 del frammento 8. L'ascoltatore della Dea deve evitare di cadere in questa tentazione. Come diciamo nel titolo di questa comunicazione, una volta ascoltato l'ordine delle parole che propongono le opinioni, bisogna evitare di seguirle. Il futuro filosofo dovrebbe legarsi all'albero della sua nave come Odisseo, che nel suo caso, nel caso di Parmenide, è il cuore della verità, riassumibile nella frase celesere esti einas. Che cosa propone Parmenide di nuovo, che sarà l'inizio di una nuova tappa nella storia del pensiero? Le doxai e le ricerche dei filosofi precedenti sono un ottimo punto di partenza. Se è stato possibile proporre come spiegazione della realtà, della physis in generale, l'umidità, l'aria, gli elementi, e se una diacosmesis è stata costruita secondo questo principio, è perché loro esistono, perché sono reali, l'umidità, l'aria e gli elementi. La soluzione che Parmenide propone si colloca in una fase, in una tappa precedente a quella dei filosofi che lo hanno preceduto. Se è legittimo studiare la realtà, è perché la realtà esiste e l'innovazione parmenidia, forse assunta, ma mai affermata prima da lui, ovviamente, è quasi una ovvietà. Se ci sono le cose è perché c'è l'essere. Se ci sono le cose in greco è onta, è perché l'essere. Anche la grammatica è nel lato di Parmenide, perché onta è il participio presente del verbo essere. Senza essere non c'è onta. A conclusione di questo lungo lavoro, un po' caotico, aggiungiamo il nome di Parmenide a quelli di Xenofane ed Eraclito, 3 filosofi che, come abbiamo detto all'inizio, avevano assunto come punto di partenza della loro riflessione la critica di ciò che si dice sulla realtà. L'esempio delle dossai è stato presentato da Parmenide come modello anche di un pensiero forse plausibile, ma secondario, perché era necessario riflettere prima sulla realtà di ogni principio o su una coppia di principi. Una volta conosciuta la realtà totale e assoluta del fatto di essere, nulla impedisce di proporre una deposmesi coerente. Come lo stesso Parmenide lo dice attraverso della Dea, quando la Dea non parla nel luogo delle ombre, quando parla da per sé. Versetto 10, la Dea dice al discepolo: conoscerai l'eterna fisica di tutti i segni che sono l'eterne nell'etere. Conoscerai l'eterea fisica di tutti i segni che sono nelle etere e le azioni distruttive della pura fiamma del sole splendente. E da dove proviene tutto questo? Attenzione, la Dea parla che tu conoscerai, il verbo è eidenai, non ti sembrerà, tu conoscerai. E conoscerai cosa? La physis, e la physis per un presocratico è l'essere. E conoscerai anche il cielo circondante, da dove tutto è nato, e la necessità che lo spinge, e come la necessità che lo spinge lo incatena per mantenerle i limiti delle stelle. Cioè la Dea domanda al discepolo di fare una ricerca sull'universo, ma non basata sui principi contraddittori della doxa. Di questo invito della Dea ci sono diversi frammenti che potrebbero farne parte, perché non suppongono principi contraddittori e soprattutto non sono ingannevoli, come quelli della doxa. Nei frammenti 11, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 e 18 ci sono delle verità che non dipendono dai principi opposti che caratterizzano l'opinione. Ma prima di quella verità, per esempio, la Luna non ha luce propria, la Luna gira intorno alla Terra, sono delle verità, non hanno niente da tossico. Ma prima di rifiutare le opinioni come spiegazione della realtà, dobbiamo sapere cosa sono le opinioni. E la Dea di Parmenide è una specie di ventriloquo che le afferma ma non le condivide. Grazie per l'attenzione.
Mille grazie Nestor per questa visione.
Dico che ho un problema di orecchie.
Volevo dire.
La batteria guasta.
Allora, grazie per questa visione splendida della doxa parmenidea. Penso che ci sono questioni, e già c'è una da Livio e l'ho aspettata. Dunque, Nestor ha problemi d'ascolto, dunque dobbiamo parlare altamente. Livio.
Allora, anche io ho problemi di ascolto e ci tenevo particolarmente a seguire con attenzione questa conferenza, perché Nestor mi aveva annunciato che c'era qualche cambiamento significativo rispetto a...
mi ha invitato a guardare Parmenide di un altro modo, ma in questo altro modo per me fa parte del primo Parmenide.
D'accordo.
Non è un altro Parmenide.
Ok. E su questo non mi sorprende molto. d'altra parte la nostra è una battaglia che dura una amichevolissima battaglia che dura da molti anni, no?
Chi cantò macchia?
Per il tuo otto.
Ora, io vorrei osservare, sono indotto a osservare che tu ti sei fidato di una tradizione che è cominciata con Melisso, continuata con Gorgia, poi con Platone, poi sì anche Aristotele, ma soprattutto i neoplatonici, una educazione collettiva a vedere soltanto la trattazione sull'essere e il non essere. Tutto il resto rimane nell'ombra, un po' marginale, con scarsi approfondimenti. E questo potrebbe essere una distorsione, della quale l'amico Nestor potrebbe essere ancora l'ultima vittima di questa distorsione. Perché? Perché il sapere, per esempio ritenere che la luce della luna proviene direttamente dal sole, sarebbe una doxa. Sarebbe...
No, perché?
Sì, perché poi la certezza non ce l'hai.
La doxa è ingannevole, quello non è ingannevole.
È una congettura, è una cosa molto probabile, possiamo aggiungere, ma io ho avuto il piacere di usare delle lenti che mi hanno permesso di vedere la Luna come un corpo sferico, ma Parmenide non aveva un canocchiale di pregio, è vero. E quindi anche l'idea che la Luna fosse sferica è una cosa assolutamente congetturale.
Beh, Parmenide non dice che era sferica.
D'accordo, tu sì però, glielo attribuisci. E poi ugualmente la questione delle diciamo, devianze sessuali degli uomini. È vero che sulle quali Parmenide si interroga cercando di capire come mai, perché. Parmenide offre delle opinioni, è vero, assolutamente inverificabili. Che cosa accade nell'utero all'inizio della gravidanza? Che ne sa lui? Ho finito. Per me poi naturalmente rispondi pure. E d'altra parte, tu hai forzato la situazione quando hai detto che le opinioni sono quelle degli altri. Parmenide sarebbe un super superbo incapace di pensare che anche le sue sono opinioni. Io non lo credo.
No, Parmenide, sempre che Parmenide utilizza 3 volte la parola opinione, dice opinione dei mortali, dei uomini.
E in tutti gli altri versi, se ha usato un'altra espressione, nei 500-600 esametri perduti.
La polemica continua.
Grazie.
Allora, grazie Livio e grazie Nestor. Nestor, vuol dire qualcosa? No. Allora, se non ci sono altre questioni, siamo al punto di 11 e dunque è tempo per la pausa di caffè e la pausa sarà di 15 minuti e vi prego di rendervi in questa sala in 15 minuti, appena 15 minuti, va bene? Grazie. Scusi per il problema di... ma adesso ha funzionato. Può essere che era un problema di questo. So thank you very much. for this wonderful presentation. Is it part of a publication you're working on?
No, it was just something for this conference.
Ah, okay. It looked like a finished manuscript. Okay. You would like some coffee?
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be down there, I suppose. Okay. Let's be back in. Oops.
Well, they're good enemies. Yeah. It's the same argument over and over.
Okay.
Now it is on.
It's on. No, because this is Nestor. Yeah. There's no one, non c'è nessuno. So. Ist das schon Ihr Becher oder ist der noch von? Dann nehmen wir einen Frisch.
Okay. Ja, wunderbar.
Machen wir so. So, jetzt bin ich mal gespannt, wie lange das mit dem Mikrofon gut geht, aber...
Bonjour, Luc. Ça va? Luc?
Ich glaube, er kann es nicht hören. Das Mikrofon ist mal wieder. So, jetzt.
Alles gleich. I think people should hear me. I'll try out. Yeah.
Jetzt können wir es mal versuchen.
Bonjour, Luc. Bonjour. Ça va? Okay.
Oui, ça va. Oui. Pardon, je n'avais pas mon micro. Hein.
Okay. It's sad that you can't be here.
As you like, you can sit here if you want, or just come up after Barbara's paper.
I mean, why don't you join us as a trinity?
Whatever you prefer. Okay.
Ja.
Jetzt. Okay. Jetzt müsste es wieder an sein. Okay.
Wäre es vielleicht möglich, dass Sie Ihre Uhr zwischen uns beiden
Das
legen?
kann
Weil
ich
dann
gerne
kann
machen.
auch
Ja,
kurz-
gerne.
Danke.
Sofern Sie mit einer komischen Zeitrechnung zurechtkommen.
Ja. Es ist nur einfach, seitdem
klar.
meine Uhr
Ja.
ist, bin ich immer,
Ich
und
brauch das.
Handy mag ich nicht so gern.
Nee, mag ich auch nicht, aber ich brauche das mit der Uhr.
Ja.
Okay.
Okay.
Chimanka Livio.
Aber stimmt das mit dem 25 ungefähr, oder?
Das stimmt, ja. Also wir sind jetzt, also ich wollte ja eigentlich um 15 anfangen, aber das hat jetzt voraussehbar nicht geklappt. Aber wir sind noch ein bisschen.
Aber wahrscheinlich muss man einfach um 15 anfangen wollen, damit man dann um halb anfängt.
So würde ich es auch ausdrücken. Okay. So, drehen wir es mal ein bisschen. Ja, okay. So, jetzt muss ich das Mikrofon noch mal kurz benutzen. So, well, ricominciamo. Adesso ho il grande onore posso chiedere silenzio? Allora, va bene. Adesso ho il grande onore di presentarvi la mia collega Barbara Sattler dalla Ruhr-Universität Bochum, che parlerà su Gorgia, parlerà su Zeno, non Gorgia.
E Gorgia.
Due. Zeno's topos paradoxes and some variations in Gorgias. So, Barbara, the floor is yours.
Okay. Grazie mille per l'invito. Es ist eine große Freude, hier zu sein und Livio und sein Werk zu ehren und seinen unermüdlichen Einsatz dafür, internationale Forscher in der antiken Philosophie aus der ganzen Welt zusammenzubringen in der internationalen Platon-Gesellschaft, in der internationalen Gesellschaft für Vorsokratiker und in der internationalen Sokratik-Gesellschaft und in den Eleatiker. Vielen Dank an Graziano und Mauro und die Kinder von Livio für die Organisation dieser üppigen Konferenz und in diesem wunderbaren Ambiente natürlich. Mi è molto di piace, ma parlerò in inglese. So I'm going to talk about a philosopher for whom Livio has been absolutely crucial to put him on the map, and Livio's work on Zeno is, of course, still extremely central. What I want to do today is to show that Zeno's paradoxes of topos advanced thinking about space in important ways by establishing the question, what's the ontological status of space, and by putting into doubt whether all the functions that we associate with space really go that easily together. So it's kind of really giving a very important push through these paradoxes to advanced thinking about space. And I'll round off with a brief variation of one of the paradoxes in Gorgias. Can you hear me all right in the back? Yeah. Okay, great. So you will have noticed I talk about paradoxes of topos in the plural, paradoxes. Normally people talk just about one paradox, namely A24. I talk about two because I think B4, which connects topos and motion, is also a paradox of topos, but whatever you want to call it, it's clear that topos plays an important role in that. So let's look at these two paradoxes. In the first one, A24, Zeno puts into doubt our account of entities being located somewhere, and in the second one, he problematizes the location of motion. Okay, so the first one, does topos exist? The earliest explicit formulation of Zeno's first topos paradox we find in Aristotle's Physics, which is Testimonium A24, and that's the first, it's T1 on your handout. Further, if topos is itself one of the existing things, it will be somewhere. For Zeno's difficulty demands some explanation. For if everything that exists is in a topos, it's obvious that also topos will have a topos, and this will go on ad infinitum. This paradox claims that if everything that exists is in a place, and place itself exists, then place will be in a place ad infinitum. But there is a problem if we want to understand the paradox fully, as Simplicius already pointed out. For Aristotle suggests that Zeno's problem can be solved with the help of pointing out different senses of n, and realizing that n topo is just one of them. Now, this solution does not fit the Aristotelian formulation here that we have just read, that everything existent seems to be n topo, because pointing out that there are different senses of n and that n topo is just one of them does not help avoid a paradox claiming that everything is n topo. So we'll need to spend some time first in reconstructing the paradox before we can look at the philosophical need. Simplicius suggests to solve the problem by having pu somewhere as the middle term in Zeno's paradox, that Aristotle could interpret as in a place first, but as in something later on. And this is also how Eudemus seems to have treated the paradox, and that's the second text on your handout. Eudemus reports Zeno's opinion as follows. Zeno's puzzle too seems to lead to the same result, for he takes it as a principle that everything that exists is somewhere, but if place is unexistent, where would it be? Presumably in another place, and that place in another place, and so on and so forth. Kai hutus aesto poso. Here Eudemus moves from being somewhere to being in a place, and also sadly follows this suggestion and reconstructs the paradox with pu as the middle term. I have given you sadly reconstruction on the second page of the handout, so you may want to turn to that now. Sadly constructed as follow. First, if there are many existent things, they will be somewhere. Second, for everything that exists is somewhere. If everything that exists is somewhere, it's in a place, and its place is in a place, and so on and so forth. But that's absurd. Therefore, if there are many things, they are both somewhere and nowhere. Thank you. And four is meant to be a contradictory result. I think there are at least three problems with reconstructing the paradox like this. First, we do not get the first premise in any of our sources. In the way the paradox is handed down to us, it's not tied to the multiplicity of things so that we could connect it with the plurality paradoxes in the way that Sadly suggests. Secondly, Plato's variation of the paradox, to which we'll come to very soon, will show that being n topo can also be problematic for just one thing. And a third, we do not get such a contradiction as for the way that Sadly phrases for in any of the versions we saw of the argument, we will see of the argument, but rather either the suggestion of an infinite regress or so on and so forth in Eudemus. Accordingly, while Sadly gives us an interesting paradox, I do not think this is the paradox Zeno put forth, or at least not the one that Aristotle read in Zeno. In the passage pointing out the problem with reconstructing the paradox quoted above, Simplicius suggests employing pu in order to reconstruct a paradox in a way that would fit Aristotle's report as well as his proposed solution. Now, I think that's a perfectly viable way to go, but I also think there's an even more straightforward way of reconstructing the paradox where we don't need pu as a middle term in between. But rather we just take Zeno to have talked about being in something. And I think that is also supported by Aristotle's second formulation of the paradox, 3 Stephanus pages further on, where Aristotle writes, and that's T3 on your handout, thus it's obvious that it's impossible for anything to be in itself primarily. But Zeno's puzzle that if place is something, it will be in something is not hard to solve. So I take it that since it was clear from the paradox that Zeno used n eventually in a local sense, Aristotle in the first account of the paradox, so in your T1, can sketch it as claiming that everything that exists is in topos. This formulation allows him to bring out the main question that the paradox will raise, namely, does topos exist? And if so, what kind of existence does it have? In order to give the solution, however, Aristotle then seems to go back to the original idea of Zeno that everything that exists is in something. So I suggest we reconstruct the steps of the paradox as follows, and that's again on your page 2 of your handout. After Sedley's reconstruction, I give my own. First, whatever exists is in something, with the support of Aristotle's second mention of the topos paradox. Whatever is in something is in a topos. Then if topos is something that exists, it has to be in something and thus in a topos. But topos would then be in a topos, which again would have been in a topos ad infinitum. And the implicit conclusion to be drawn from this is that topos does not exist, because if there were an infinite series, we would not be able to give a genuine answer to the question where something is. So we'll see that either the first premise, whatever exists is in something, or the second premise, whatever is in something is in a topos, will be questions by subsequent philosophers in order to resolve the paradox. We need, in fact, 2 more premises, as scholars have pointed out, in order to for the paradox to really work. First, we need to assume that there cannot be reciprocal or cyclical containing, which of course would prevent an infinite regress. And second, we need to presuppose that nothing can be in itself, because if something can be in itself, then again, we do not need to assume that every place has to be in a place that's different from itself. Okay. So what's about the philosophical problem that's actually raised here? I think the paradox displays a structure that points to 2 problematic features that the notion of topos seems to exhibit. So the problematic structure is the infinite regress structure, right? The paradox seems to show that there's an infinite chain of places, so that we'll never get a real answer if we ask where something is. Because if I answer X is in A, then it will continue and A is in B and B is in C and ad infinitum. And even if you get rid of places, we may get caught in an infinite chain of things being in other things. So there may still be an infinite regress if we don't do it with topos, but just say X is in A and A is in B and so on. So being in R also seems to be problematic. So it seems we have 2 main problems here, philosophically speaking. The very notion of topos is problematic because we can't ask a question that we can ask straightforward and in normal circumstances with everything else, namely, where is it? What's its place? And if we do this with topos, we get into an infinite regress, or with being in something. And the second problem that is raised here is, what kind of existence does topos have? What's its ontological status? Topos does not seem to fit the criterion other existent things fit, namely to be in something as in a place. So the way of treating a topos as, or a location like a thing in the way that you may think Hesiod does cannot be maintained. But if place is not like other things, and if we get into a paradox, if we ask questions about it, like the ones we ask about bodies, what then is its ontological status, and what is its relation to other things? Now, it could either mean, if there is this problem about its ontological status, it could either mean that it does not exist. And I think that's what the paradox most straightforwardly suggests us to assume. But it could also mean that it does simply not have the same ontological status as other things have that are in a place. And then if we go down this route, it could either mean that it's a necessary precondition for other things, and in a sense ontologically prior, or it is dependent on these other things, as Aristotle will eventually come to suggest, and therefore ontologically posterior. In any case, Zeno's paradox does raise the question what kind of existence place has, and the atomists Plato and Aristotle can be seen as analyzing this problem further. Before we go on now to look at the way at how philosophers afterwards have immediately reacted to the paradox, let's briefly consider how much plausibility the initial assumption of the paradox has, that everything is in something. Now, you may think prima facie this is a category mistake, as we have come to call it, if we ask where is place, where is topos, in what is it. However, if we look at the spatial notions explicitly discussed before Zeno, I think we get a sense that this paradox may be much less naive than it may seem at first. So if we recall the first significant image of space we find in Hesiod, the Carson, then you have this idea that we first need to have a Carson, a location, before some other entity can come into being, Gaia. And then with Gaia, once generated, we have her and Mount Olympus to be there for the other gods to come into being. So while we need to have some space for entities to come into being, these spaces are, on the other hand, not clearly distinguished from the entities which come into being in them in the creation process. I mean, perhaps most prominently, Gaia is taken itself as such an entity, but it's also the place where Zeus hides and so on. And against such a background in which spaces are treated like entities, Zeno's paradox, which treats topos exactly as a thing on the same footing as the thing it is in, seems to raise an appropriate question. And I think the beginning of Aristotle's treatise on topos in book 4 also supports that. So Aristotle there claims, again, that's on your handout, for of what exists, everybody assumes that it is in somewhere. For what is not is nowhere. For where is a stagecoach or a sphinx? So in this passage, Aristotle seems to take it as a common sense assumption that everything that exists is somewhere. And similarly, in 208b-33, Aristotle claims that Hesiod, as well as the hoi polloi, assume that everything is somewhere and in a topos. So the background of Zeno's paradox, that what exists is in something, seems to rely on one of the great teachers of the Greek people, Hesiod, as well as on common sense, according to Aristotle. And I think actually to some extent it also represents our common intuition in assuming that everything is somewhere. So if you're claiming, Perugia is a wonderful town, but, it looks like a normal town, but if you look closer, there are ghosts in there. And then, one very normal way for me to react would be say, okay, there are ghosts, so where are they, right? And if you can't tell me where they are they in this palazzo or in this other palazzo or in the hotel, then it seems that settles the question. Okay, and I think that relies on a similar intuition than the one that we see in Zeno's paradoxes. Okay. What about subsequent philosophers and their solutions? Subsequent philosophers took the paradox serious, at least to the extent that they implicitly or explicitly reacted to it. Lycippus and Democritus' distinction between atoms and the void allows for blocking the infinite regress of this paradox by understanding void in such a way that it itself does not exist in the same sense in which bodily things exist that are in a place. And Plato provides us with a variation of this paradox in his Timaeus before he shows us how he blocks it. That's again on your handout, the quotation from Plato. I quote, "And we say that necessarily everything that exists is in a place and occupies some space, but what does not exist on earth or in heaven is nothing," unquote. The claim that everything that exists must be in a place and occupy some space, while what does not do so cannot exist, seems to allude to Zeno's paradox, presenting the first premise of the paradox without yet suggesting that here is already a paradox in place. In the Timaeus, we are told, however, that this is a claim in a dreamlike state. since what truly is, and for Plato this is the forms, is not in anything and cannot come to be in any other. This variation in the Timaeus thus attacks the truth of the first premise in the reconstruction given that everything there is has to be in something. And you may think that it is not yet solving the paradox, because for that Plato would have to show not only that the forms are not in something but also topos. But I think by showing us an exception, namely that not everything is in something else, not everything is in a topos, it kind of makes it clear that not everything in order to exist has to be in a topos, and therefore we are losing our motivation for the infinite regress to get going. Aristotle in his Physics blocks the conclusion with two different solutions by demonstrating the second premise to be false. So Plato attacks the first, Aristotle the second. This first solution in Physics 4, chapter 3, Aristotle points out that things can be in something in 8 different ways. For example, a whole can consist in its part. While being in something in the sense of location is a prominent sense, it's by no means the only one. And topos can thus be in something in some other sense, namely, I quote, like health is in the hot as a state of it, or the hot is in the body as an affection. This move gets rid of an infinite regress, since it implies that we do not need a new item every time. The health of the body is in the hot, and the hot is in the body. Now, this relation is not strictly speaking reciprocal, but includes a bit more complicated version of reciprocity, of being in, namely the x of the y is in the z and the z is in the y. But you can see how it suggests the possibility of reciprocal relations. So I think we have two moves in the first solution. First, something that showing that n is not necessarily locative, and second, showing that we do not necessarily get into an infinite regress if everything is n something, locative or not, because n can display some form of reciprocality. Later on, Aristotle shows that the universe is not in something else in a locative sense, though we may think that it can be n something in the sense in which a whole is in its part. So that's the first solution that Aristotle offers, and he also gives us a second solution by showing that place is in something in the way that a boundary is in that in which it is, which it bounds. This understanding of topos as a boundary of a thing implies that topos itself does not require another topos for its existence. All it can require is the thing which it is bounding. So both Plato and Aristotle think that Zeno's paradox can be blocked, but both seem to think that Zeno's paradox does raise a worry that is important enough to be directly addressed. And both have to deal with the question that Zeno's paradox raises, namely, what kind of existence does place have? What is its ontological status? Can it be treated like a body or not? And that's, of course, questions concerning the ontological status that were prominently raised again some 2,000 years later in the exchange between Leibniz and Clarke. Okay, second paradox, which will be much shorter, where can something move? This B4 connects place and motion and raises the question how we can indicate where something is if it's moving, and how this function relates to providing a location more generally. Space seems to allow us to locate something as well as being a necessary condition for motion to take place. But how do these two functions go together? The basic version of the paradox is as follows, and that's again on your handout on the second page. I quote, "But Zeno does away with motion by saying what is moved moves neither in the topos in which it is, nor in the topos in which it is not." Spelled out further, we can understand this paradox as follows. First, what moves either moves in the topos in which it is or in the topos in which it is not. Second, but it cannot move in the topos in which it is not. Third, and it cannot move in the topos in which it is. Conclusion, thus it cannot move at all. So the first premise, I take it, is a straightforward exhaustion of the possibilities of where motion could take place, either where the object that moves is or where it's not. The second premise seems to be obvious from the fact that nothing can be in motion somewhere where it is not. And the third premise, that it's not moving where it is, seems to be supported by the thought that if something that has a place, then it's actually not in motion but at rest. As I understand it, this paradox rests on two different ways of dealing with place or space in the background, one as location and one as a condition of motion. The third premise assumes that topos is something like a box that of the same size as the thing whose possible motion we are considering, since it is only in a place which is of the same size as the thing in it that this thing cannot move. And that account of location seems to be useful if you want to locate something precisely, and then you really want to have the little box where only it is and nothing else. But if motion is at all possible, according to such an account, it would have to be a kind of jumping from one box place to another. So no motion is possible in such a topos. The second premise, on the other hand, seems to be because something needs to be somewhere in order to rest there or to be in motion there. So here topos, the topos where something is seems to be understood as a region where something is either in motion or at rest, since only given such an understanding of topos can we claim without further explanation that something has to be in this space in order to move. If we thought of place as a box place, then there would be no good reason to assume that motion has to occur in it. Motion would rather take place between these box places. So looked at it this way, I think the paradox shows us that topos has to fulfill two functions, namely giving an account of where something is, so where something is located, as well as an account of where something is moving. And the paradox shows that these two functions may not very easily go together. Perhaps we need, in fact, two different concepts, one for location and one to grasp motion, which seems to be what, among others, the Epicureans do when they capture these two different functions with the help of two different terms. Topos refers to the space that is occupied by a body, while chora indicates the space a body is moving through. In this way, I think Zeno's paradoxes of topos pushed forward the thinking about space and place in two important ways. They raised the question whether the functions we implicitly understand topos to perform can indeed be consistently conceived and fulfilled by one and the same concept, and they raised the question what kind of ontological status we should grant topos vis-à-vis the things that are in it. And that they're less well known, of course, than the motion paradoxes, but the fact that they are very influential in ancient times already can also be seen from the fact that we find a variation of one of them in Gorgias, and that's the last little thing that I'm turning to, the variation of the first paradox, A24, in Gorgias. Of course, we also have variations of it in Plato's Parmenides, but I'm only looking at this first variation. Gorgias' argument survives in two versions, one in Sextus and one in the pseudo-Aristotelian treatise on Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias. What I'll do is I first give you just both texts and then I'll reconstruct it with the help of both. The argument that I'm zooming in is part of a bigger proof showing that being can neither be ungenerated nor have come into being. So the variation we find in MXG is as follows. Again, that's on your handout. Gorgias declares that if anything is, it must either be ungenerated or else have come to be. If it is ungenerated, he assumes by the axiom of Melissus that it is unlimited and declares that the unlimited cannot exist anywhere. It cannot, he argues, exist in itself or in anything else, for on the later supposition there would be two unlimiteds, that which is in something else and the something else in which it is. And being nowhere, it is nothing, according to the argument of Zeno about space. It is not therefore ungenerated, nor again has it come to be. And then the variant we find in Sextus has important differences, so it's not just small, tiny variations. And again, I'll read it first, it's on your handout. For everything that comes to be has some beginning, but what is everlasting insofar as it is ungenerated had no beginning. But if it had no beginning, it is unlimited. But if it is unlimited, it is nowhere. For if it is somewhere, that in which it is different from it, and what is will consequently not be unlimited, since it is contained by something. For the container is greater than the contained, but nothing is greater than the unlimited, so that what is unlimited is not anywhere. Further, it's not contained by itself either, for that in which and that which is in it will then be the same, and what is will become two things, place and body. For that in which is the place, that which is in it, the body. But this is absurd. Thus, what is not in itself either. So if what is everlasting, it is unlimited. But if it is unlimited, it is nowhere, and if it's nowhere, it's not. Consequently, if what is everlasting, it's not real at all, unquote. Among the scholars of Gorgias, you all know there is this big debate whether the MXG or Sextus gives us the better text of Gorgias. I'm not entering into that, but for my reconstruction, I'll mainly use the Sextus text as it gives us actually the richer argument and supplement with what we find in MXG. So I reconstruct the basic argument as follows. First premise, what exists is somewhere. Second, the apeiron cannot exist in something other than itself, nor in itself. Third, the apeiron cannot exist in something other than itself, for then it would not be apeiron, as it would be contained and thus limited by something else. And that's the version we find in Sextus. According to the version MXG, there would then be two apeira, and that presumably means that at least one of them cannot really be apeiron, since it would be limited by the other one. Fourth, nor can the apeiron exist in itself, for then the one apeiron would be two things, that which is in something and that in which it is. And then finally the conclusion, therefore the apeiron cannot be anywhere and thus cannot exist. So in this argument, Gorgias attempts to prove that the apeiron cannot exist, because both of the possibilities of being anywhere, either being in itself or being in something else, are not available to it. We see that also Gorgias's variation rests on the assumption that existence is tied to being somewhere, to being in something. But the further argument, why the object investigated cannot be anywhere, is not a general argument concerning problems with the idea of something being somewhere in general, but rather it's pointing out a problem specific for apeiron. It is what we understand by apeiron, that is extended without limits, that conflicts with the idea of being anywhere and thus means that it cannot exist. Now the overall argument, I think, in Sextus boils down to if what is everlasting, it is unlimited, but if it's unlimited, it's nowhere, and if it's nowhere, it's not. Consequently, if what is everlasting, it is not being at all. So that's the aim of the whole argument. Now, apart from being an interesting variation of the first topos paradox, Gorgias's account can also be seen as the place where body and topos are clearly distinguished for the first time. The way they are distinguished is by their function. That in which is the topos, that which is in it, the body. And it's made clear that the same thing cannot perform both functions. Now, we may think that this is false, that the same thing, a body can also act as a place. So when you ask me where your chocolate truffle is, and I say in my stomach, then your chocolate truffle is now situated in my stomach, then it seems clear that I or my stomach or whatever is acting as a place. So bodies can act as a place in various ways, but bodies cannot function as a place in the very same respect as they function as a body, so that it could be in itself, right? So my stomach cannot be in itself, right? If I had an operation of my stomach and you ask it, where is your stomach now? I couldn't just say, well, my stomach is my stomach. A body can only work as a place for some other body, a piece of chocolate, for instance. But to distinguish these functions in a clear way, the body, how a body acts as a body and how it can act as a place, seems only to have happened and presumably only to have been conceptually possible once Zeno raised the question what kind of being, what ontological status topos and space really have, and in this way, so to say, really paved the way for a lot of important distinctions in our thinking about space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for keeping so excellently to the time schedule. So we have about 10 minutes for discussion if there are any questions. There is one. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask a conceptual question, but also a lexical one. I noticed that regarding the first paradox, there is the vocabulary indicating existence varies some. So in T1 we have T prolonged, in T2 we have ST, which falls short of telling us that the T really belongs to the onta. There seems to be some looseness in the decreasity of the vocabulary. And also, the other thing that I find striking is that everywhere in the stage, other than the creative aspect that has a different function, there is a condition. If topos is one of the onta, then it must exist somewhere. And I wonder, first of all, whether this does indicate some uncertainty as to whether or not topos is an existence, properly speaking. Second, if it does, who that uncertainty is it Zeno's or is it Aristotle's? And the third is a remark that when you get to Stoicism, the uncertainty is solved through the ontological distinction between existence and subsistence, because the things like particulars exist, but time, place, void, and the variables subsist only. So they don't, strictly speaking, they don't belong to the concept.
Thanks a lot for that, Rula. As the editor for the space book, of which this will become a chapter, you will be happy to hear that I have a footnote on the conditional. So that is taken care of. But I think, and thanks a lot for pointing out the Stoic connection. I should definitely bring this in. As for the conditional, so this is in Aristotle's formulations, the conditionals, and it is very interesting. My reading at the moment is that Aristotle brings in this conditional because he wants to say, well, if you assume it is to be an existent, then you seem to get into this problem. Now here's my solution, and then we see that this conditional doesn't really hold. And so because it is in these passages, Aristotle reporting about it, I think this is in some sense already foreshadowing him basically making clear, okay, you may think here is a problem, yeah. But what you say about the existence being indicated in different ways, I think this is important. Now, I think I should make that clear in the way you have done. It seems that at the point, in order for the paradox to get going, they just seem to assume also, well, if it is a T, basically it is an existence. And the reason why I take it there may be this uncertainty is exactly because at the point of Zeno, I don't take it that different. whatever you want to call it, degrees of existence, or exactly what we had with Stoics, or we may also think we have with Plato, so is not yet there, right? That we kind of distinguish different forms of being. And so perhaps this is a foreshadowing of, okay, here's a little bit of an uncertainty, but so far, they are all somehow onta, they are all T, and therefore we get into this problem. But thanks a lot. I think I should take up that point because it's metaphysically also very interesting. Yeah.
Yes, please.
So thank you for your talk. It was very, very inspiring. I have another question, which is concerning conceptual qualification regarding your T8, which is the report of sexes and periods. There is one premise, I think, of this argument, which is that we from there atheist. And I'm not sure that I can grasp what is the link between something which has no athe and something which is athe. Because we may imagine that it might be possible an ungenerated universe or thing, which nonetheless is something which has limits. So I would like to ask you about the meaning of athe in this precise sentence, because for me it's a little bit confusing.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very interesting question, and we find actually a similar relationship in Aristotle's treatise on the aperon in his physics book 3. Where also, the kind of aperon he wants to allow ultimately is kind of a potential one. I mean, we have to qualify this some more, but basically, he doesn't want to have an infinitely extended body. And there, one point he brings in is also, well, if you have thinkers you think about an arche, then you can't have an aperon, because the idea seems to be as soon as we have something where things start from, an origin or something like this, then it's not completely aperon. So the idea seems to be, if something is aperon, then it is aperon in all directions. So spatially, you can't have Euclid, you later on have infinite lines, and they can have from A to ad infinitum. That's fine, we don't see the problem. But that's not how Aristotle in that passage, and I take it also Gorgias, think about it. But the idea is, if something's really aperon, it has to be extended in all dimensions, also temporally. We can't have something starting. I mean, traditional Greek gods have a beginning and then seem to, live forever. Aristotle kind of also tells us already that doesn't seem to work. But in any case, it's the same idea that if we talk about aperon, it seems we're always talking about something that can have no limit whatsoever, right? And an arche, in a certain sense, would be such a limit, because it would mean at some point in time or at some point in space, there is a limit. And therefore, if you have an arche, you don't have an aperon.
Yeah, I don't know if you would agree that nonetheless the problem may remain that might prove that everything being aperon has no arche, but perhaps not everything having lacking arche is suffering.
So what you would normally need is to say, okay, at least it's not limited by arche, and then you would have to say, okay, could there be other limits, right? And if you think this is the only possible limit, then you are there. If you think there could be other limits, then no, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, Raphael.
I just read a short addendum at text 5, and they say that unnecessarily everything that exists is in a place. It seems to be interesting to know that Plato uses the term to be in its ordinary sense, and also in its Parmenidean sense of ion, always being kineton and anoretron. That's perhaps interesting to know.
Sorry, is that to suggest that I should translate it differently, or is that just to suggest we should be aware of the background, or what exactly was?
No, just only a very good text by Plato uses expressions like go on and usia and doxa in literal senses, an ordinary one and a more philosophical one.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, I completely agree. Is that, I mean, you know, this is, I just give you the beginning of what he wants to do in the Timaeus here. And this is just because I think he really refers to Zeno. That he then goes on to say, well, what truly is, and then using being also in a, that's why I also thought in reacting to Vula that with Plato, of course, we have different senses of being. And here we are starting out with him just taking up this kind of more general one. Yeah.
Yeah, we have, oh, sorry.
Christopher.
Was Christopher first and Beatrice Bossi afterwards?
Sorry.
Okay, Christopher.
I didn't understand your answer. Sorry, Barbara, I simply didn't understand your answer to the first question. You say that something is apeiron.
To the second question, you mean?
In one, sorry, the question over here.
Yeah, second question, yeah.
If something is apeiron in one dimension of the word, it's apeiron in all.
No, so, I mean, this is, I think, clearest in Aristotle's treatise. That's why I brought it in. That it's the other way around. If something is not apeiron in all dimensions, then it is not apeiron. So there he's basically not considering, infinite lines that you may start somewhere, and where you can have many infinite lines. He's just thinking if it's something infinite, it has to be in all dimensions. That's the point.
I still don't understand how you start with aganaton and then end up with. We're trying to disprove the existence of something aganaton, but how do we get? I mean, it seems to be pure sophistry. What it does say is pure sophistry.
Well, I think it.
It makes no sense. How do you prove the non-existence of an aganaton without playing all different senses of it?
Okay, so I think there is some piece of sophistry in there. I don't think quite it is that big piece. I think, what if we look at the larger argument, then we get an equation of aganaton. Well, we get the idea that we deal with something that's infinite spatially, and then we deal with it temporally, and this is just kind of translated from the one to the other. So I don't want to defend that this is a completely sound argument. That was not the idea. The idea was, sorry, just to show that what he does here for the apeiron, right? In order to show that if something is aganaton, it has to be apeiron, and then therefore it's actually non-existent. That for that he also relies on this Zeno point that Zeno made problematic and that he takes up, namely that it has to be in something. I think there are several equivocations in the whole argument if you look at it. There are several problems. All I wanted to bring out here, I'm not denying this, but all I wanted to bring out here is how Zeno is used again. My reconstruction was one attempt to make rough sense of the argument without kind of, I have another 2 pages where I go into the equivocation that we get in there. This was, keeping it to time and.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear if you weren't defending the legitimacy of this argument.
No, but I think. No, what I said to this person is there is other evidence where apeiron and archaea are thought in a similar way, and I think in Aristotle's physics that one of the reasons maybe he's doing physics, therefore he's interested in especially bodies. He's not interested in lines. Yeah, so I think that's what the background of Aristotle is. It's not the background of Gorgias. I'm not trying to defend this as a sound argument. I'm trying to reconstruct it nevertheless, how it may be strongest read, even though I see the problem. Yeah.
Okay, we have still one question pending from Beatrice Bossi, and that may have to be the last question then, because we have one more speaker on our program.
So, he distinguishes, I'm sorry, bias, but so he distinguishes, the processes. So to own here does not mean, of course, forms, but any kind of universe has to come into being, and so requires this hypothesis to solve problems.
Okay, good question, Beatrice. The thing is, I gave this paper once in front of David Sedley. And David Sedley said, oh, but Plato is not solving it because he's not sort of showing that topos is not somewhere. And so that's why I have this extra thingy built in saying, yeah, you may think that it's not solving it, yeah? But then I go on. But in the end, by showing that not everything is in a topos, then it immediately makes us think, well, perhaps topos is not in a topos anyway. We don't have the old quantification any longer that would require us to assume that the topos is in a topos, and therefore, in some sense, we could say absolutely it's solved. It's just he doesn't make that explicit here because, well, he's more interested in other things. But yeah, I'm with you on that. Have this David Sedley kind of variation.
Other thing. That, Aristotle has to deal with this problem about the unmoved mover, God. In physics, he says, okay, so we're there, he is there. So, and in the metaphysics, he changes and says nothing about this. So maybe even Aristotle is fighting this.
Yeah, that's a good connection. I mean, it is very interesting with the unmoved mover that on the one hand in the physics he's very precise, it's at the edge of the universe, right? And you feel like, well, if it's not extended, why would it have a place or a location, right? And then the metaphysics seems quite different, and the question is it perhaps after all not just a final cause but an efficient cause, and so on. So there's a host of problems in there, but you're right, it's an interesting question whether the same kind of uneasiness may still survive in Aristotle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been a really lively discussion, which I hate to to break off, but we have still Richard here waiting, and with Richard we are coming back to the festeggiato, to Livio, because Richard is going to present the volume più recente di Livio, Ripensare i presocratici. Allora, like in a bookshop. So Richard, you need the microphone. Please go ahead.
Let me start out by saying, can you hear me? Is this okay? No?
Closer.
Yeah, closer. Is this audible now?
Yes.
No, is this audible now?
Yeah.
Yes?
Can you hear him? Yeah.
Can you hear me okay in the back? Yes? Okay. To present Professor Rossetti's most recent book in this celebration of his many years and contributions to learning is an honor I scarcely deserve. I'm grateful to the organizers and especially to Dr. Graziano Ranocchio for their assistance and patience. And of course, I'm delighted to be here to join the celebration of his Cinquant'anni di Studi del pensiero greco. And I can also add that 50 years ago, I started teaching at Pomona College, so we have something in common. All right. Professor Rossetti has written quite a number of books, and I don't have all of them. I don't think my shelf would hold them all, but in any case, this is a theme that has occurred in other books of his that I happen to have, such as La filosofia non nasce con talete and Thales the Measurer, which came out just last year. And I'll be quoting some of this book since it is directly related with some of the material in the latest book. His new book His new book, Ripensare I Prosocratici, is truly revolutionary in its approach, and I'm confident that it will be much discussed in the near future. I personally believe that it's a turning point in the study of early Greek thought. In the course of the book, Professor Rossetti presents new ways of understanding the figures usually known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, but not only them. After treating Homer, Hesiod, Aesop, and Solon as predecessors, itself a highly unusual beginning, he unearths such overlooked people as Alcmaeon and Democedes of Croton, Theagenes and perhaps Hippus of Reggio, Hecataeus of Miletus, Hippon of Croton, Menestor of Sybaris, Clydemos of Metapontum, and Euthymenes of Marseille. This book concludes with a novel interpretation of Zeno's paradoxes, followed by the 5th century sophists and their radical influence. Of these unfamiliar figures, Alcmaeon is presented as the father of human anatomy, Hecataeus as a traveler, Hippo as Alcmaeon's disciple, and Menestor as a, it breaks off. This is a rich and revolutionary book, and I cannot possibly do it justice in the time I have today. I will call attention to some points that I think will be useful. First, the notion of philosophy, and also an instance of the abuse of this word. The people known as pre-Socratics are usually called pre-Socratic philosophers. Now, this is wrong for several reasons. First, because many of them lived while Socrates was alive, and in fact, Socrates was born before some of them. But there it is in Kirk and Raven's work, The Pre-Socratic Philosophers, a title continued in the re-edition known as Kirk, Raven, and Schofield, and in my own Philosophy Before Socrates. Another mistake is to call them philosophers, although we find the word in many well-known volumes, such as the Cambridge Companion to Early Greek Philosophy, Daniel Graham's collection, The Texts of Early Greek Philosophy, the French work Les Écoles Présocratiques does better on this account, but it sets out to discuss les premiers écrits des philosophes. But why should they be called philosophers? Was Thales doing philosophy when he discovered how to calculate the height of a pyramid? Or when he declared, if he did so, that all things are water? What do these claims and discoveries have to do with philosophy as we know it? And what is philosophy anyway? Here are some possibilities. Things that end in ism, such as realism, utilitarianism, Platonism. Well, that doesn't get us very far, does it? A list of topics, such as ethics, metaphysics, and aesthetics that have little to do with one another. What's the common thread? Would a person who says, my philosophy is to lead well enough alone, be a philosopher? In all these cases, much of what Thales and most of the other so-called pre-Socratic philosophers did is irrelevant to philosophy as we think of it. I've been puzzled by this problem for some time, and here are some thoughts. One approach is philological. What does the word philosophy mean? This question invites us to go back to the origins of the word philosophia, namely the Greek words philos and sophia. We may agree that sophia means wisdom, and that a philosophos is someone who likes wisdom, or who engages in wisdom, or attempts to obtain wisdom. On this reading, philosophia will be the love of wisdom, or the engagement in wisdom, or the attempt to attain wisdom. But this isn't very helpful, since we're left with the question, what is wisdom? And saying Sophia is not helpful. Here's another try. We can search for early uses of the word Sophia and Sophos, and we'll find it in Homer. Can't get earlier than Homer. He has the first preserved use of the word in Iliad, Book 5, line 412, where it refers to the manual expertise of a carpenter. In fact, the earliest use of the word in the sense we're looking for seems to be, at least according to Liddell and Scott, in Plato, Apology 20e. And Plato used the word, roughly speaking, to mean what he and Socrates did, which covers a lot of ground, including what we think of as science, as in the Timaeus. I need also to mention Christopher Moore's recent suggestion that philosophos was originally a pejorative word that was only later taken over and given a positive tone by Plato. This is his book, 2020 book called Calling Philosophers' Names on the Origin of a Discipline. I recommend that book. Fourth, if we take Plato as a reference point, we see that philosophy is many things. It's found in conversation, as with Socrates, and in writing. In conversation, it's represented as a practice where people, or just one person, explore difficult matters by discussing them. And in writing, it can be thought of as the product of such conversations. As we see in Plato's dialogues, the discussions tend to be general and abstract, even if they sometimes begin by dealing with a particular practical question. Much more can be said about the nature of philosophy, but the conclusion I've drawn is not that there was no philosophy before Plato, but that he invented the word love or friendship plus wisdom for his own purposes. This is not to say that the so-called pre-Socratic philosophers did not do philosophy, but that, as it appears, they had no name for what they were doing, and perhaps wisely so. To turn now to Professor Rossetti's new book, Ripensare I Prosocratici, significantly subtitled Da telete ansi da Omero ad Zenone, the question that might occur to us is, why stop at Zeno? What happened to Melissus, Anaxagoras, Leucippus, Democritus, and Diogenes of Apollonia, who were usually considered pre-Socratics? I suppose that the defensible answer is that they were born after Socrates and so were not pre-Socratics. If this was Professor Rossetti's intent, it is certainly defensible. And as a first indication on the cover of his book, that this will be a different kind of book on early Greek philosophy, and the Ripensare is a key to the revolutionary nature of this fascinating book. In my philosophy before Socrates, I followed the lead of many distinguished scholars, including Diels and Krantz, Kirkgraven and Schofield, and in using the word philosophy, even though a few authors more correctly had titles referring to early Greek philosophy rather than pre-Socratic philosophers. Professor Rossetti begins with pre-Socratics, Homer, with pre-Socratics, Homer, Hesiod, Aesop, and Solon. He then, more than a quarter way through the book, deals with the first traditional pre-Socratics, Thales in 20 pages, Anaximander, 14, Anaximenes, 8 pages, Pythagoras, 8, Xenophanes, 14, and also gives Pherecydes of Cyrus a brief appearance. Heraclitus comes next in most other books on early Greek philosophy, but Professor Rossetti inserts 5 lesser-known characters before getting to him. Alcmaeon of Croton, 10 pages, Democritus of Croton, 2, Diogenes of Rhegion, I don't know how many, Hippias of Rhegion, 1, and Hecataeus of Miletus, 14. Next come the usual suspects, Heraclitus, 12, Parmenides, 24, and Empedocles of Acragas, 10, Zeno, 22 pages. Receives separate treatment later, and Melissus is mentioned only a few times, always in passing. Brief chapters are also devoted to other minor figures. Hippon, a successor of Alcman, 6 pages. The botanist Menestres of Sybaris, the physiologist Clydemus of unknown origin, and Euthymenes of Massilia, 6 pages. Many of these people are well known, but fully none of them are included in other many of them are not included in, 9 of them are not included in other standard works on early Greek philosophy. Alcmaeon, Democritus, Diogenes, Hippias, Hecataeus, Hippon, Menestor, Clydemus, and Euthydemus. And of these, only Hecataeus is well known, but as an historian, not a philosopher. This may well seem to be an odd cast of characters, but once we abandon the straitjacket of the traditional catalog of pre-Socratics and look at these same people from a different perspective, they take on a different appearance. And, as Professor Rossetti demonstrates, they are only part of a broader picture of intellectual and physical exploration that was fed by intelligence and curiosity about the as yet unknown. Here I'm thinking of the pioneers Euthydemus the navigator, Menestries the botanist, and Clydemus the physiologist, and especially Alcmaeon of Croton. Professor Rossetti calls Alcmaeon the father of anatomy, and I cannot do better than to read out some of his discussion to give an idea of his thoughtful and questioning approach and his lively style. So this is a quotation. Several sources concur in letting us know, one, that Alcmaeon was able to practice dissection and thus trace, among other things, the connections that lead from the brain towards the eyes and then spread out. Two, that he spoke of the multiple transparent films that envelop the eye. Three, who even went so far as to speak of the middle ear, specifying that that cavity echoes the sounds transmitted by the air. Four, who was able to say something about the nose and tongue, adding five, that the four senses are connected to the brain and depend on it. These observations about the sense organs and brain must obviously have required, he says, the acquisition of very special skills. And I want to call attention to this. He doesn't just give the results that they had, but he talks about what it would have taken for them to find these results, to achieve these results. This is unusual, I would say. Just think of the design, creation, and refinement of tools for dissecting very small parts of the human body, as well as the refinement of techniques to identify, for example, the four transparent films that we read envelop the eyeball, as well as a set of criteria to guide research and a great desire to be able to see and understand things commonly considered inaccessible to humans. But they tell us of an enviable competence as well as investigations undertaken to know and understand and not to cure. In order to carry out such investigations, Alcmaeon would have needed, among other things, to set up a not too dysfunctional environment in which to carry out dissections, and to set up, I like this, a continuous search for new cadavers to dissect. But he would no less needed to devise explanations capable of overcoming the more than predictable reluctance of people to practice dissection, and thus reassure those who would have to deliver corpses to him. Here, we are therefore talking about a massive and prolonged commitment. Just think of the time needed to organize such a job and to develop the not inconsiderable skills required, and an activity that was capable of absorbing all his energies. His many and no less structured observations on the fetus and the newborn imply that he also practiced dissection on the bodies of women who had died before giving birth, and perhaps even on fetuses expelled during pregnancy. As we're told in this fragment A13, in Des Krantz, he taught that nothing precise is known about the formation of the embryo, at least about its initial stage, but in any case, the head is formed first because that is where the governing principle resides. His recent book, Daly's The Measurer, which he kindly sent me, unexpectedly sent me last year, gave a foretest to the present volume. In both books, Professor Rossetti asks new questions that require exploration and thought, and he comes up with new answers. For example, Thales is reported to have determined the height of the Great Pyramid during a visit to Egypt. I suppose we all know that. However, Professor Rossetti asks whether he could really have done this. And in order to answer this question, he asks how he might have done it. What would be necessary? Earlier authors have said that the length of the shadow of a stick is equal to the height of a stick, the stick. If it is, then Thales could have used this approach to determine the height of the pyramid. But Professor Rossetti asks, how could this be done? Is there in fact a day or days during the year when the pyramid's shadow is in fact equal to its height? If so, at what times of year does it occur? And whereas it's easy to measure the shadow of a stick, how could he measure the shadow of a pyramid, where the shadow begins not just below the pyramid's pointed top, but at the edge of the entire structure. He concludes that we can say, after a long discussion, he concludes that we can say at best that Thales might have been able to make a rough estimate of the height of some minor period, small period. He would not have been able to mark the ground with lines that would have allowed him to know whether the shadow was aligned with the period, with the big pyramid or not. And he had no way of predicting the rare occasions on which the shadow touched the axial line and the sun was at 45 degrees, and making sure that he was there on that day. However, Thales returned from Egypt with a theoretical result that was still of the first magnitude. The idea that, in order to come to know for certain how high a certain pyramid is, all that was needed was for the sun to be at 45 degrees when its shadow fell on its axis. A result like this might in itself have been thought to be a powerful inspiration for others to seek out intuitively difficult measurements. Indeed, there was a certain perfection in the operation Thales proposed, an almost superhuman promise to achieve knowledge of the height even of the Great Pyramid, itself such an extraordinary artifact that, if there were not other smaller pyramids next to it, one might one might have thought it a superhuman work. Certainly, about something like this, one must have been excited and ignited the imagination of the still young Thales. In his new book, Professor Rossetti emphasizes the idea of primary ideas. He says that anyone might wonder how tall the Great Pyramid is. But Thales discovered a way to get the answer to the question, whether or not he actually did get the answer. He goes on to imagine that, back home in Miletus, Thales might have constructed a miniature pyramid in front of his house and used it as a model to explain what he had figured out. This would have been something entirely new and hugely fertile. In addition, he discovered other primary ideas, predicting eclipses, explaining earthquakes, and so on. Anaximander, another Milesian, whose life largely overlapped with Thales, proposed, perhaps not coincidentally, some primary ideas of his own. As afterwards did Anaximenes, another Milesian. And Professor Rossetti reasonably supposes that once the idea of primary ideas had been discovered or invented, primary ideas that lead to questions, is this idea true? How can it be shown to be true or false? Others can and did apply the same method to identify and solve other puzzles. So Professor Rossetti sees Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximene not as three individuals acting each on his own, but as interacting with one another and learning from one another and utilizing for their own projects the techniques and approaches discovered and put to use by others. I find this an attractive way of viewing the three Milesians, and I hadn't thought of it before. Usually, each one of them is considered on his own, as if all three were strangers to one another, something which, on reflection, I find virtually impossible in a small Greek city where there would be no barriers of distance, social standing, or any other kind that could pose an obstacle to their meeting frequently and engaging in what I suppose were truly fascinating conversations, perhaps the first conversations of that kind that had ever taken place. A great merit of this book is the way Professor Rossetti looks beyond the meager testimony we possess on these thinkers. For example, his chapter, Writing in the Time of Thales and Anaximander, asks the obvious questions, although, again, I hadn't thought of them. How did the ideas and discoveries of these two pre-Socratics become known? What was the state of writing in their time? Could Thales and Anaximander even write? If they dictated their ideas to the scribe, which is likely, how accurately did the scribe write the words as they were dictated? Another example. Some testimonies state that Thales determined the height of a pyramid, presumably the Great Pyramid of experiences it, but they don't say how. And Professor, as I said, Wright reasonably asks whether in fact he did, and he opens up the questions whether he did visit Egypt, whether he saw the pyramids, and reported on the latest, with the result that later on, when he became famous, the story that he measured the height of the pyramid was invented to increase his fame. Not only did he see it, but he did it. Professor Rossetti proceeds to ask whether he could have made the measurement, and if so, how? Among other things, he would have needed to see that there was a relation between the height of the pyramid and the length of its shadow. Then, to verify that the shadow cast by the sun was sometimes long enough to reach beyond the pyramid's base. He would need to have understood that at some times of some days, the length of his own shadow is equal to his height, and to have generalized this to apply to all physical objects. He would have had to ascertain on what day or days this happened, and to do this he would have had to visit the pyramids regularly or send others to do it, but who knows how accurate or responsible they would be without his supervision. Okay. Since it happens only twice per year that the shadow would have that property, he might have had to wait a long time for the event to occur. In addition, since the pyramids were royal tombs, they may have had guards who might have caused difficulties or made it impossible to do these measurements, and so on. These questions, evidently, as far as I know, had not been asked or pursued before Professor Rossetti's 2022 book, but they're certainly permanent if we hope to find out the truth rather than simply repeat the legend. Another merit of the new book is the attention Professor Rossetti pays to figures not included in the standard treatments of the pre-Socratics. Alcmaeon, the father of human anatomy, as I said, Hippon, the disciple and follower of Alcmaeon, Menestor, the botanist, Clydemus, the physiologist, Euthymides, the navigator. These people are largely unknown, both in recent writings and in the little mention they receive in ancient sources. True, as far as we know, they did not engage in making claims about the basic forms of matter and the other topics typical of well-known pre-Socratics. But they pursued knowledge, and some of them engaged in investigations in embryology, for example, that display the kind of curiosity we associate with pre-Socratic thought. I believe in cooperation and collaboration, and it pleases me to think, for the first time, that many of these foundational figures were not lone rangers, but, even if they did not form research groups, associated with one another. And we all know about the ideas we can pick up from others, even in casual conversations, and how that kind of experience can lead to new ideas of our own. I could go on, but I hope I've made it clear that this is a revolutionary book. It's led me to rethink my understanding of the pre-Socratics and also the sophists who are discussed towards the end of the book in a chapter of their own. I believe it will be a landmark in this study of the history of philosophy and more broadly of ancient Greek culture.
Allora, penso che noi tutti ringraziamo Livio molto per il regalo di questo libro, che c'è molti copie qui. Allora, questo sarà la fine della sessione di questa mattina e penso che Graziano va a dirci qualcosa sopra gli eventi del giorno.